Welcome to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service. Each week, we bring you 4 expert witnesses answering one pressing question from the news. In early June this year, the President of Catalonia, Carles Puigdemont, stood in front of a microphone in a stone courtyard filled with orange trees. The ancient palace around him had been the seat of Catalan government since the Middle Ages. Back then, Catalonia was independent. Now, it's an autonomous region that's long been part of Spain. With his floppy fringe, glasses and salmon-pink tie, President Puigdemont seemed an unlikely revolutionary. But his speech that day proposed a momentous change, a referendum in October this year when Catalans will vote on whether to leave Spain and become an independent republic. Independence is in the air. Just 2 days earlier, a tweet from the president of Iraqi Kurdistan announced a referendum there too, at around the same time. The question? Whether Iraqi Kurdistan should become independent of Iraq, where it too is currently an autonomous region. But both these votes face a big problem. Their national governments haven't agreed to the polls. Spain and Iraq say no matter how people vote, these regions won't be becoming freshly minted states. So this week on The Inquiry, we're asking who gets to have their own country?
Part 1. A People's Prerogative.
It's been a very hot topic in a few different places I've lived.
Our first expert witness is an Australian who moved to the UK and found an independence campaign on his doorstep.
I don't know whether I'm a sort of a bad omen, but I moved to London and then the independence movement in Scotland got going.
Dr. James Irving teaches international law at the London School of Economics. So who gets to have their own country?
Well, if you think back to your earlier history, it really was the rule of force. Conquest was a valid means of acquiring territory, and those entities which could enforce their jurisdiction, ultimately through force of arms, were the entities which went on to be the recognised states.
But in the first half of the 20th century, this might is right approach to national borders played a hand in 2 disastrous world wars. A new approach was needed. So the concept of self-determination was included in the founding document of the United Nations.
Self-determination is an attempt to do better than that and to create some kind of justice in the process of self-government. It appeared after the Second World War in legal form, and initially it was put in the UN Charter.
Delegates representing 46 nations came to San Francisco on April 25th, 1945. Representing almost 2,000 million people, more than 80% of humanity. They came to design together machinery to end war, a curse which in 30 years had killed 40 million human beings.
And I think a lot of people thought it sounded like a good idea, but there wasn't a great deal of agreement on what it meant.
This concept of self-determination became more concrete with the decolonisation movement of the 1950s and 60s.
And in that context, it gave a legally required opportunity to colonial peoples to choose either independence or some form of association with either the colonial power or another state.
If the people of a colonised territory wanted their own country, then the principle of self-determination suggested they should have it. In most cases, this happened peacefully. But there was one catch.
The basic rule was a Latin phrase called uti possidetis, and what it meant was that you would get the territory of the colonial entity at independence, and that then ruled out further separations or consideration of changes in borders.
So in practice, self-determination wasn't a tool to break states up into smaller countries. Borders remained unchanged, but there was a huge change in who controlled them.
I'd simply have to look at a map of Africa and go through them. Rwanda, Burundi, any number of states, something like a third of the planet's population had its political status changed under the auspices of the operation of the principle of self-determination. And so you had the number of states quadrupling since the Second World War. So you might say, well, that's a huge effect.
From just 51 countries in 1945, the United Nations today has 193 members. These days, most bids for independence aren't about freedom from a colonial power, but the idea of self-determination is still powerful.
It still obviously is the norm which groups like Scottish nationalists, like nationalists in Catalonia, and others will look to if they are trying to make a claim under international law. I think in terms of decolonisation, largely that worked, and so the law made a positive contribution. As we've come out of decolonisation, it's obviously had a lot more trouble making a positive contribution.
The reason for this trouble is geography.
The biggest difference is that European colonialism created a group of political entities that were quite geographically separated from the rulers and could be relatively easily hived off.
Our first expert witness has explained how self-determination became the principle that has allowed former colonies to become independent countries. It worked well when borders didn't change. But what if they do?
Part 2. The Curious Case of Kosovo.
I had the very interesting experience of being in Serbia at the time of that Olympics, and it was very late into the night when they do the parade of flags. I was watching to see what was going to happen with Kosovo.
Back in 2016, James Kerr-Lindsay was at a friend's house in Serbia, a country in the Balkans where the status of the breakaway province of Kosovo is a very touchy subject.
And I thought, are they going to do this? But no, to the credit of the Serbian state broadcaster, it showed the Kosovo athletes marching out with the Kosovo flag, and it was a very, very interesting moment.
James Kerr-Lindsay is an academic at Oxford University and has written a book about Kosovo. We'll explain its situation in a minute. But first, he says self-determination is only part of the story when it comes to who gets their own country.
I think the big change that we've seen since the end of the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations, is this understanding in the international community that the borders of states will be sacrosanct, that there will be respect for the territorial integrity of states.
Territorial integrity is a fancy way of saying that borders shouldn't change, from the outside or the inside.
The problem is that then ran up bang smack against this idea of self-determination. How do you marry those two principles, that borders can't change and yet people should have a right to determine their own future?
The solution was to say that for people living inside the borders of the country from which they want independence, self-determination gives a right to autonomy, local control over local issues, but it stops short of giving them the right to their own country. This issue largely wasn't a problem during decolonisation, but has come to the fore more recently, most famously in Kosovo.
So when Yugoslavia broke up, it was understood that you had these 6 republics. They were understood internationally as having a right to independence. It was actually fairly uncontroversial.
Serbia was one of those republics, so it ultimately became a country. But Kosovo was a province of Serbia, within its borders, but with a different ethnic population. In the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo had enjoyed a large degree of autonomy. So when Yugoslavia broke up,
they said, well, look, we see these other republics which are different. They've been granted a right to independence. Why shouldn't we have that right?
But independence would have changed the borders of Serbia and violated the principle of territorial integrity.
The international community's first response was to say they should have a right of internal self-determination. This is a province of Serbia, but they don't have the same right to independence that the other republics had. So once they realised that they weren't going to get independence through peaceful means, they launched an uprising.
A brutal war with Serbia followed, which only ended when NATO came to Kosovo's defence in 1999.
The question is then that the international community faced is, how do you manage this situation? You've got a territory that is officially recognised by UN Security Council resolution as being part of Serbia. But there is no hope that the people are ever going to accept living under Serbian rule again.
The international community tried negotiations to find a solution, but these failed. Then, in 2008, Kosovo unilaterally declared independence. Serbia wasn't happy, so they challenged the declaration in the Court of the United Nations that settles international legal disputes, the International Court of Justice, or ICJ.
This was actually one of the most important cases that the ICJ had ever been asked to look at, which was essentially the question put before it was Kosovo's declaration of independence in contravention of general international law? And the court actually said there's nothing under international law that says a territory can't declare independence. So, for example, I could declare this studio to be an independent state, and the International Court of Justice has said, well, I'm not breaking any international law if I were to do that.
The Republic of BBC Studio S45. It doesn't really trip off the tongue. Perhaps you think your backyard might make a more interesting kingdom or principality. But before you start designing the passports, is it really that easy? Did simply declaring independence make Kosovo a state?
On the question of statehood, the court was very clear. We are not judging whether Kosovo is a state or not. That's not for us to judge. We haven't been asked to do it. We're not going to do it. The Declaration of Independence wasn't contrary to international law. What's going to matter is whether states recognise it.
So far, we've been trying to find out if there are rules about who gets their own country. Broadly, if you're far away from the place you're declaring independence from, you're okay. If you're within its borders, you're not. But then along comes Kosovo and rips up the rulebook. It turns out anyone can declare themselves a state. What matters is whether other states recognise you. So how does that work?
Part 3. Limbo Land.
There's a set of caves called Los Gil Caves, and there's these old primitive cave paintings, and you could just walk up and touch them, and it's in the middle of nowhere, and it's just an incredible place to be.
Our third expert witness has a pitch for an unusual holiday destination.
Some of the landscape is absolutely breathtakingly gorgeous. It's welcome and it's open. The people are friendly.
Rebecca Richards is a lecturer in international relations at Keele University in the UK. The friendly, welcoming place she's tempting us to travel to is Somaliland, a former British protectorate in the Horn of Africa, which became part of Somalia in the 60s. When Somalia's government collapsed in 1991, Somaliland unilaterally declared independence, and ever since then they've been getting on with doing the sorts of things a country does.
There's a remarkably strong government that's had a series of democratic elections. It's peaceful, it's stable, there's an incredible amount of economic development that's taking place. It's pretty much everything that you would expect to see in a state.
But before you book your holiday there, there's one small problem.
Somaliland's not recognized by anybody.
As we've heard, anyone can call themselves a country, and like Somaliland, you can do a pretty good impression of actually being a country. But the final piece of the puzzle is recognition. So what is it?
We're talking about recognition of the ability of a government to exercise control within that territory and not have anybody else claim control over that territory.
And how does that work? Is it something that states just do on a one-on-one basis, or is there a central clearinghouse of recognition?
That's an incredibly murky area because there's nothing that says this is exactly how it works. The best way to judge it, really, is whether a political entity is part of the UN. If you are a member of the UN, you are a sovereign state.
Individual countries can recognise each other, but membership of the United Nations is the big prize.
It gets you a lot. If you're not a state, you aren't protected by international law. If you're not a state, you can't access international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, which essentially means you can't get loans. If you're not a state, you don't have control over your borders. You have less access to economic networks and economic mechanisms. You're not protected by trade laws, so it's more difficult to create trade agreements.
If you're not recognised by the UN, most people would say you're not officially a country. So what are you?
I call them unrecognized states, or just states sometimes, which creates a bit of confusion. Essentially, it's the old adage, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it is a duck. We recognize that it is state-like. It's just lacking that recognition.
And how many of these state-like places are there out there?
Probably about a dozen.
Among these unrecognised states, Somaliland is a unique case. Not only is it not a member of the UN, it hasn't been officially recognised by any other country in the world. The reason is that it's seen as part of Somalia, so recognising it would violate Somalia's territorial integrity. What about Kosovo? Remember, it also unilaterally declared independence.
Kosovo has been recognised by more than half of the UN members, but it's still not recognised as a sovereign state because the UN as a body does not recognise it as a sovereign state.
And some recognition means you get some of the benefits of being a state.
Kosovo has gotten part of the deal. Kosovo has access to things like the World Bank, the IMF, the International Olympic Committee. And a lot of that is probably due to how Kosovo came about. And it was essentially administered by the UN. There's been a lot of UN and international support in the creation of Kosovo.
So who gets to have their own country? Our third expert witness has explained that although in theory anyone can call themselves a state, if other states don't agree, life is going to be pretty tough. So why do some get recognition and some don't? Like many things in life, it's all about who you know.
Part 4. The Rule of Great Powers.
I really got intrigued in this area of international law through my own personal experience growing up in a country where there was conflict and there was this strong sense of peoplehood and ethnicity for separate, relatively small groups.
Milena Stereo grew up in Serbia, where the complexities of statehood were part of everyday life.
The joke that I heard at the time was that Serbs would do anything for Kosovo except go live there, that basically nobody in Serbia really wanted to go live there.
She's now a professor at Cleveland State University in the United States, where she teaches international law. So who gets to have their own country?
Support by other states, including the very powerful states, those that one might call the great powers, I think is extremely important. And so it's essentially impossible for a group to become independent and claim its own statehood unless other powerful states are willing to support it.
What does it take to get the great powers to back you? Let's look at East Timor, which was a Portuguese colony until the 1960s, when it was invaded by Indonesia. The Indonesians were a valuable US ally during the Cold War, so the East Timorese independence movement received little support. But when the Cold War ended,
the Western great powers, essentially embarrassed by the human rights violations that were taking place in East Timor, backed off and essentially said, okay, now you, the people of East Timor, you get to exercise this delayed right to self-determination.
And do you think that the existence of the human rights abuses was crucial to getting that great power support for this case?
The people needs to demonstrate that the mother state is unwilling to grant these internal autonomy rights, and that is really best demonstrated if there's a record of human rights abuses and sort of no respect for democracy or an undemocratic regime such as the one in Indonesia at the time.
In 1999, the East Timorese voted for independence, which they got in 2002. But the process was marred by violence and needed political support from the United Nations and the intervention of international peacekeepers.
In most successful cases, there has been some international community involvement, either through the United Nations or through NATO or some other international organization that has come in and has administered the disputed area. That was certainly the case in East Timor, that was the case in Kosovo, that was the case in South Sudan.
So you've got to kind of convince the international community that there's a problem that can only be solved by statehood. So a lack of democratic and human rights and the involvement of the international community are key. And then the great powers have to agree it's in their interests. Kosovo is recognised by the US and other Western powers who are supporting it as peacekeepers, but full UN membership is vetoed by Russia, a historic ally of Serbia, which also doesn't want to set a precedent for its own restive territories like Chechnya. So what does this mean for this year's independence votes? Do the Iraqi Kurds and Catalans get to have their own countries if their national governments don't want to let them? Let's start with Catalonia.
There is no war or violence or human rights abuses or conflict in Spain, but Catalonia has been claiming that essentially it has been subsidizing the rest of Spain, it's paying too much tax and it wants to be independent.
Under the rules we've heard about, self-determination would give the Catalans a right to autonomy, not independence, because of Spain's right to territorial integrity. So if they vote yes to independence,
I really foresee a negotiated solution where Catalonia remains in Spain with perhaps a heightened degree of autonomy.
and if, just say, as a hypothetical, if Catalonia did just unilaterally declare independence, there aren't going to be great powers lining up to recognise an independent Catalonia.
No, I really don't foresee that. And actually, what's really interesting is that Spain is one of Western democracies that has actually not recognized Kosovo as an independent state because Spain is afraid of establishing this independence-seeking precedent because of Catalonia threatening the territorial integrity of Spain.
And although the situation of the Iraqi Kurds is very different, Milena Stereo says that ultimately they will run up against the same problem if they vote for independence: lack of great power support. So who gets to have their own country? It turns out that any group of people who control a piece of land can claim independence. But life is going to be pretty tough unless other countries recognise you. The right to self-determination is a powerful tool to build a moral case for recognition. But these days, unless that case is bolstered by human rights abuses or a problem the international community needs to solve, the deck is stacked against you. After all, almost every state has its own restive regions, and none of them wants to give the impression that getting your own country is easy. That's all for this edition of The Inquiry, and from me, James Fletcher. The program was produced by Simon Mabin, mixed by Rod Farker, and edited by Bridget Harney. Thanks for downloading the podcast. If you're in the market for another one, I want to suggest to you one presented by my colleague, Tim Hewell. He's not been around the office much lately because he's been on an epic voyage, and you can join him. You're going to be travelling by ferry, rowing boat, horse-drawn wagon, and even with aqualungs. The Compass podcast explores the world, and this latest brand new series takes you around the Black Sea, going over and under its waves to discover its secrets. Empires have clashed there for centuries, and tensions are rising again. To join this journey over 5 episodes, search for The Compass on your podcast app or go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.